UVA Darden.
Good Disruption, a lively discussion between UVA Darden School of Business professors Yael Grushka-Cocaine and Mike Lennox on cutting-edge technologies and practices that are challenging the status quo.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Hey, hello. Yael. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm curious. We've been doing this for a few years now. Can you believe it?
Can't believe it.
I know. So I think it was your idea, the whole good, bad disruption angle. I'm curious, how do you define good? Well, let me start. How do you define disruption? And then we'll talk about how would you think about bad disruptions and good disruptions in abstract.
2 years, not everybody knows. Let's take a step back, right?
Okay.
It's a really interesting concept. And it's a word that obviously has much broader use in society.
Of course.
And it's usually used in the pejorative, right? When we talk about disruption, it's usually a negative thing.
Yes.
Our use of it, of course, references typically technologies or changes in, technology regimes is often the term I would use.
Okay.
And so disruption really, in my mind, goes back to notions that the famous economist Joseph Schumpeter, he coined the phrase, the gales of creative destruction.
Ooh.
So if you think about a lot of the work in economics has really been about when do we get these market equilibriums that balance supply and demand and set prices? And this is a wonderful thing that we kind of have come to have a better understanding. Schumpeter was very interested in the dynamics of innovation.
Okay.
And the dynamics of markets. And so this notion of when do new innovations come along and restructure the competitive ordering, that was the notion of the gales of creative destruction.
Okay, can you tell us more when you say restructure? Does that mean that there has to be winners and losers? There's going to be companies that will fall out. There's going to be a big step change in terms of that equilibrium of supply and demand and pricing. Tell us, what does that
I think the answer is probably all of the
okay.
And I think what makes the notion of disruption sometimes hard to really concretely define. I think in our kind of canonical examples, right, when we talk about big technological shifts, one, obviously there's consumption. Right. And you can look at diffusion and adoption. So the new technology starts to get diffused and adopted at a higher rate than whatever was kind of the old, substitute.
So when people stop buying their Nokias and everybody's buying their iPhone, that's a disruption.
Right. Or even go back further in time when everybody is using a washboard to wash their clothes and then they start buying washers and dryers. Right. That's a disruption, a complete kind of transformation in the way we're consuming, or what technology we're using. So that's number one. Number two is that often when we have those types of technology shifts, we do have this change in the competitive ordering. So whoever were the most successful companies in the years past may go away, may not, but there's going to be a change in that ordering. Okay. So you might have, I always talk about, the Studebaker brothers, who were the number one horse-drawn carriage manufacturers in the late 1880s or so. And along comes the horseless carriage, the automobile. They made the transition. So it wasn't like the automobile put them out of business right away, but they never gained the same level of prominence. And eventually they did go bankrupt and are now this footnote in history.
And so folks, there are some clear examples that you can find in any textbook, Netflix replacing Blockbuster, Tesla maybe tried to disrupt the car industry. And I know that where you come down on that discussion, Nokia and iPhone, and the like, Kodak, et cetera.
Yeah. And again, and I think if you just look throughout the economy over, the past century plus, innumerable examples of this type of, again, technology transition, and the patterns are, again, every time is unique, but there are some kind of common things that we see every time, these types of disruptions occur.
So we're talking about like the market share consumption, like how much use they're getting these technologies, and the companies have to reorganize what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one we've talked about a number of times on this podcast, AI.
Oh,
right?
yes.
And one of my favorite things that's happening right now is there's a lot of voices out there that I think are correctly saying there's likely a bubble here, right? That there's too many companies have entered in this space. Many of them have very flimsy business models, and there's going to be a shakeout, right? Well, some people interpret that as if it's a fad. And so they'll reference things like the .com boom and bust.
Yes.
And my standard joke about that is like, yeah, that internet thing, it just was that fad we did in the 90s and it just went away. No, of course not. Like, it has been a transformative, disruptive by the technical definition, technology. I think the same thing's happening with AI. Again, we've talked a lot about that. But we see these patterns. We see these patterns where you get massive entry and then a shakeout.
Right.
That's very common when we have technology disruptions here. We have the emergence of new entrepreneurial entrants is often a feature of these disruptions. Doesn't mean they always win. In fact, often the earliest entrepreneurial entrants fail.
Yeah, Better Place was a company that was very early on in the whole electric vehicle.
Rio was the first MP3 digital player. And so we have, history is littered with these companies who kind of come in maybe too early or didn't quite have it right, and then become these footnotes. So again, all of this is kind of expected when we have these technology transitions.
And so when we think about good disruptions and bad disruptions, then it's a little bit, of course, a subjective assessment. And you and I, being maybe with our background and, engineering and the like, we're a little bit more prone to good in most cases.
To being a little biased.
A little biased, yeah.
Disruption, yes.
What does a bad disruption look like from in your perspective?
Well, I think, we talk about this quite frequently, the negative consequences of technology. And I think you're hard pressed to find instances where there is never any downside to a new technology. I think there's always, and maybe this is important to separate out, there are the downsides in the moment of disruption.
Right.
People lose their jobs.
Right.
Again, industries that
companies shut down.
One thing that I'm very interested in is there is often a agglomeration effect, as we call a fancy word for basically like a geographic bias for where innovation emerges. So there are cities throughout the United States and Europe and other places as well that used to be the global center of X.
Right.
X gets disrupted by a new technology. And not only does the industry and the companies go away, but then the communities fall in disarray.
Yeah.
I think you could make that argument about like Detroit in the United States went through a period where retrenchment in the auto industry caused, the city to really struggle. And so that's the short run, like disruption and the negative sides that is often highlighted, job loss. And again, those community.
That immediate direct effect.
Immediate direct effect.
Right.
And then, of course, there are the kind of what we might say negative spillover effects as well. I always like to point out, like with the automobile, when it came about, it solved a huge environmental problem, which was manure.
Yeah.
Right. They was literally polluting our cities and processing tons of manure in places like New York City. Highly, controversial and problematic.
From the horses, right?
From the horses.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. From the horses. They weren't pulling these things by cows. I don't think. But so we have the automobile and it's, in some ways this environmental savior. And then, of course, as we know, it also emits greenhouse gases. And now we're worried about climate change and we want to see a transition to electric vehicles. As many people will always, the smart ass person that will always point out, like, well, electric vehicles use batteries and batteries have a lot of bad stuff. And the answer is yes. And I think what we're trying to do in this podcast is weigh the positives and the negatives, right?
Okay.
And do the positives outweigh the negatives enough for us to declare good disruption? Or do we think that at the end of the day, this is actually a bad thing for society?
Well, let me push on that even further, because sometimes and rarely do we declare no disruption.
Sure.
Is there an essence that maybe our bad disruptions could be seen as no disruptions in the sense that over time they disappear? Like a good disruption is one that, yes, there's going to be some negativity immediate and some side effects, which we know are not always positive. That is true for, as you mentioned, every disruption. But ultimately, good disruptions or disruptions that stick and have longevity are good because they actually fundamentally change the way that people consume whatever it is that they're consuming, and they stick around, right? We are still washing our clothes with the machines, even though, there are alternatives. But So is it maybe bad disruptions just over a while, people realize that they're bad and they decay and disappear? Or do they stick around?
Maybe, but I actually think a second thing happens. And again, I'm going to be putting my pro-innovation bias on the table here is, necessity is the mother of invention,
Right.
the famous line. And this idea that every time we create a new technology, there are going to be negative spillovers and negative impacts of it. And you know what that does? It motivates us to innovate again.
Right.
So the way I would think about your question is it's not that bad innovations just kind of go away. It forces us to go back and start to innovate again and try to correct for those. So that's a very common pattern we see with innovation is that, again, creates this problem and then we invent a new. Battery technology, one of the big problematic pieces with lithium ion batteries is the use of cobalt.
Right.
Controversial, mineral and the like. And there are already products on the market that don't use cobalt in their batteries there. And they would purposely try to invent it out because of the problematic nature of that. So that's how this process works.
Oh, we know
the problems and try to innovate new solutions that address the problems of
we knew, or for at least for a while, we were certain that any use of aerosol was affecting our ozone layer directly. So we found solutions for that, right? Alternatives. Yeah.
Ironically, one of the main solutions for CFCs, the causation of the ozone hole, were HCFCs, which are a big greenhouse gas emitter, which is a separate, atmospheric problem. But again, and then we innovate again and we try to correct it. And I think what makes this topic, maybe frustrating to many is, I don't want to be Pollyanna, right? It's not like innovation just naturally solves all of our problems over time. I think both of us subscribe to a viewpoint that innovation is intentional.
Yeah.
And it's people at the end of the day who make decisions about what do they want to investigate, where they want to place their resources. I think both of us, as business school professors recognize, is there a market incentive?
Yep.
Because that is a incredibly powerful change mechanism when those things come aligned. Again, that's what Schumpeter was saying 100 years ago,
right,
was this really powerful impact markets can have on innovation because it creates these high-level incentives to invent the world anew. So how do we untap that?
Yeah. And this notion that a good disruption can be good for society, good for individual consumers who want to consume it, and good for the innovator that can make money off of it to continue to invest and to innovate. And that sometimes I think people feel uncomfortable with here. At Darden, we like to talk about the multifaceted stakeholder perspective that might kind of feel more comfortable with that.
Though I would say, and again, I very much subscribe to the view that you really have to take a systems perspective in understanding these processes. And we don't talk as much in our podcasts about like the role of the state, but look at the history of any innovation. It's not often that it is truly purely the two people in the garage invent and then off we go.
Right.
Take Elon Musk and Tesla. There was numerous research projects done in the basic R&D, often at universities, that fueled our improvement on battery technology that allowed electric vehicles to be moderately viable. There were federal grants that helped Tesla scale their production, that Tesla, to their credit, paid back on time, or actually earlier than were even required, those grants. And so this interaction between the government, the society, and the market often is where these kind of innovations and disruptions take place. And one of my great interests, and one of the things that I worry about is that engine of economic growth and creation and then solution generation, is it continuing to be robust?
Yes.
Either here in the United States or globally. There has been some really interesting research of late that has shown that the number of breakthrough technologies being invented or innovated is going down.
Yeah.
And there's a number of reasons that might be. One of them I think is really interesting.
It's not that we invented everything there is to be invented, right?
Well, that's a little bit not. I don't think we're anywhere near that. But there is this problem.
We haven't made it completely to Mars yet. At least I haven't. So, right.
Right. But one of the challenges is things get harder every step of the way. So think about athletic records, right? Running whatever it might be, the 100-meter dash.
Yeah.
you set the record, then somebody works harder and trains better and figures out a new approach and they beat the record. And then so, but each time,
Will there be a limit?
yeah, it gets harder and harder. And maybe there's no limit, but we might have to wait 20 years for someone to shave zero point 0.1 second off the record. I was just reading recently, I think it's the triple jump the record has stood for 30 years, right? So it's the same with innovation, that I think as we move down these learning curves, each next incremental step takes that much more effort.
Well, I think about it, as you know, I do decision analysis. I think about everything as probabilities, right? And so when you think about innovation and disruption, for me, it's those tails, right? You're trying to find those ideas that are out there on the tail of the distribution of ideas, if you will. And this is...
We might call them extreme events.
Yes, extreme events, for instance. And so how do you get to that tail? How do you push it? So one, as you alluded to, you need investment, because not your first attempt is not going to get you there. You need multiple attempts to kind of try and find it, to try and search for it, to take risks. And those require high investments sometimes. And so not everybody's able to do that. And if we want to continue to innovate and come up with disruptions, because ultimately we think that it's taking society in a good direction, you need to infuse that. You need people to be willing to do the portfolio thing, to try 10 projects so that one comes out in that tail.
Yeah.
But also, once you're in that tail, progressing along it and getting even further out is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Unless you fundamentally shift the entire curve, which I think that there are some efforts that do, and some industries that still have that room to go, getting more extreme events in that tail is going to be increasingly harder and harder.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if you reflect on the U.S. kind of innovation ecosystem, especially since World War II, the model has been one in which the federal government basically subsidized basic R&D. Think about the NSF, the NIH, the Department of Defense, and DARPA, which invented, the internet, and not Al Gore, but DARPA. The reason for that is basic R&D is very hard for corporate interests to really get enough benefit out of to encourage them to invest. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's just, highly, highly risky, as you were saying. I mean, you're really throwing a lot of things at the wall and hoping one of them sticks.
Yep.
So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge I think that we need to recognize is in that upstream basic R&D, you often have a lot of spillovers. So the problem is, even if I discover the great new thing, it's really easy for others to copy it or innovate just a little bit around it, and then they benefit from it. So we talk a lot about like appropriability, who appropriates the gains from innovation. And as we were talking about earlier, it's not always the person who originally had like the big light bulb idea and came up with it. History, again, is littered with, these amazing, I'll call them inventors and not entrepreneurs here, who kind of invent something new, but they never really fully capture the value that they create.
Yeah, isn't there some Tesla story related to this a little bit?
I think any technology probably has some of these stories. So you have this basic R&D apparatus, run through our universities. I think the other incredible thing we developed in the United States, starting in the 50s and 60s, was our venture capital industry.
Yes.
So we brought, to your earlier point, money and capital.
People willing to give you and invest in you for you to take these risks.
Really figuring out a model that can work financially to invest in still not this basic R&D, but still early stage technologies and early stage businesses to kind of get them down that pathway. But then there's a third piece, which I think you were highlighting, which is, how do we then scale?
Right.
And there's been some interesting, worry, I think, in the United States that manufacturing and the ability to build things is also part of the learning process. So we talk about learning curves, but learning comes in a lot of different ways. Learning can come from, kind of what we typically talk about, just that kind of approach and innovation, and I'm learning as I go. But there is very much this notion of learning by doing.
Yes.
And as I manufacture, I figure out how to do it better and I move down that curve. And so are we able to continue to innovate if we don't actually build and make things ourselves? If everything gets outsourced, it's the outsourcers we're seeing that actually might move down the learning curve.
Yeah, and that speaks to some of my operations research background, and you have it too, operations management, and what it takes to be good at production and actual manufacturing, which is not trivial. And there's lots of learning and innovation there too.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where things are today. It feels to me, and maybe this is like always, I'll blame my age or my generation, but it feels to me like there's so much going on around us right now. AI is just the tip of the iceberg, but there's like so much disruption all over the place that it feels like it's quite unsettled, meaning, and definitely since COVID, but even maybe before, there's so many new ideas and new emerging technologies that people are almost getting a little bit phased, meaning they're disinterested because they're like, okay, what is this new Snapchat? That's old. New, social media, whatever it is. The new fad of the day, people are becoming a little bit more indifferent to it because it's overwhelming. Is there a sense of that?
So I'm going to tell two contradictory observations.
Okay.
If you go back in history, every generation says technology is moving too fast, and the world is.
So I just sound like my mother and like my grandmother.
Right. So, and I mean, literally, you can go back to Wall Street Journal or New York Times from 100 years ago, and they'll have articles about the world is moving too fast. We're innovating too much. I can't keep up. Right. Back then it might have been the automobile and the airplanes and all the things that were coming in transportation. So I think that's a truism. There is also evidence that the pace of these industry life cycles that we study and look at is increasing.
Okay.
If you look at something like the Fortune 500 companies, the turnover in them is actually much higher now than it was 50, 60 years ago.
Meaning the companies that are on that list.
Turning over, and other ones are rising up, quicker. I mean, think about, NVIDIA, right? Like this is a company no one was barely talking about 6 or 7 years ago, and now it's one of the most valued companies in the world.
Yes.
So I think there is something to be said that the pace of change is accelerating, and that is very disruptive. Use that word. For the individuals. I mean, how do you think about it? How do you see the world in this moment?
Well, I definitely think that you're right, that it feels like there's more turnover, more surprises. And while, yes, the generation divide is there, I'm thinking about this mostly from a consumer perspective. So from individuals' lives, I think that in a way we are becoming more savvier consumers of all of this. We pick and choose, right? We pick and choose. I'm really into the fitness, so I'm going to go all in and invest in my watch and in my apps and in my whatever, as opposed to somebody who's more into, let's say, the cars. And so you go all in and you have 2 electric vehicles and you've invested in your whole solar, panels and stuff. I think it's really more of a pick and choose type of situation where some people are kind of, very much disruptive, but in a much more micro way, in a very dedicated, myopic way to whatever fits them and whatever they're interested in. But not everybody's adopting everything. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And it comes up something else that's been coming up frequently on our podcast, which are, dare I say, like income inequality and the perverse effects this might have on just kind of societal ordering to be grandiose. And obviously this has come up repeatedly with AI. The idea of a jobless future, the idea that this is going to massively increase productivity, which should actually reduce the number of workers in a given space. That I think is, again, dare I say, it's giving technology a bad name, if you will. I remember the heady days of kind of everybody wanted to be in Silicon Valley and be part of that change. It ebbs and flows. I think we're maybe back in one of those moments right now with AI. At least there's a lot of people, rushing for gold in AI. But the narrative feels different.
Well, I think we go through cycles, right? We go through cycles, and this podcast could very well, be a geopolitical conversation around how, forces around the world are affecting how we view technology, how we view the media, and how the media affects how we view disruption and technology, if we're giving it a bad rep or embracing it. And what I love to see is also just the genuine day-to-day in entrepreneurial spirit of individuals. Like everybody's a little bit of an entrepreneur, and everybody's willing to kind of take a little bit of a risk in different ways.
Well, it's interesting your point about kind of geopolitically. I just recently was at a conference where we had representatives from North America, Europe, and Asia, really talking about the future of innovation and entrepreneurship. And we're in a moment where after roughly 50, 60 years of liberalization in the sense of like breaking down trade barriers and the like, led to this global exchange of technologies and marketplaces. And, the word that people have been using is decoupling, especially between US and China. And especially with the rise of the use of tariffs again and the like we're moving into a very different epoch than we had been in the last 50, 60 years. It has huge implications for innovation. Where technologies arise, how they arise, what markets are available to technologies as they scale.
Where you manufacture, how you learn from the manufacturing process. Yeah.
And again, with especially some of these digital technologies, the security and defense concerns that these now have become issues of national security. Do you have, the computational power to run these large models? Is becoming, again, not just an economic issue or even a social issue, but a governance and military issue.
Right.
Maybe they've always been, but it is making it feel like a disruptive time in the history of
disruption. Well, maybe that's our bad disruption, but
well, maybe we should end this discussion with that exact conversation, which we've always have.
Right.
If we think about our current moment, are we in a moment of good disruption, bad disruption, or no disruption?
Oh, it's hard. It's hard. That's a tough question. I kind of feel like it's definitely a disruption.
So no disruptions out.
No disruptions out. I think things are changing, and they're gonna, as we said earlier, they're gonna breed other innovation that people are gonna come up with in order to deal with the current disruption. I feel like there's a little bit of a maybe skepticism and doubt and lack of trust. So from that perspective, I would say bad. Just because people don't trust the technology, don't trust the so-called disruptive technologies. So maybe they won't embrace them as much, or maybe they will only use or highlight the negative aspects of them. So in that sense, I'm a bit skeptical. Long term, I think that ultimately we will, creativity will ensue, and we will turn lemons into lemonade, and it will become
the mist that you are is coming out.
That eventually it will only yield us or push us to yield better technologies and better innovation and disruption, although maybe in unexpected areas.
Yeah, and I think again, it's probably an impossible question to answer, and I think when you look out at the world and what's happening now, it is easy to say it's being disruptive, and maybe it's bad disruption. I'm an optimist as well, as you know, and as our listeners know. And, what's the line from Matthew McConaughey, life is a flat circle, or the world's a flat circle, time repeats itself. I do think there's an element of truth to that we have these epics that emerge. I do think often when we have these epics, it actually ends up being maybe more innovation actually occurs and emerges, and we get step change functions during these, quote unquote, highly disruptive times. So I'm gonna play the eternal optimist and say, while the path might be, as we talked about in the moment, really disruptive and can be very disruptive to people's lives and the like. I think we come out at the end in a better place as a society and a world. One
would like to hope. That is for sure. Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing. I always learn from our conversation.
Same here. As always, let me thank our producer, Gary, our lead researcher extraordinary, Becky, and our other additional researcher, Katie, who has been incredibly helpful, again, in making Yael and I look maybe a little bit smarter than we are, or at least have some knowledge of these topics that sometimes we come into and we don't. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Good Disruption is a podcast from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.
Darden.